Today we're going to be refreshing the entire suspension system on my brother's Infiniti G37. As you can see, this car has been slammed on 20s and my brother hasn't taken it for an alignment. As a result, the entire suspension and the tires have completely worn out. So before we take the vehicle for an alignment, we're going to give it a complete suspension refresh by replacing all of these worn components, including the ball joints, stabilizer links, control arms, and tire rods on both the front and the rear. Now we're going to begin this refresh starting at the front of the vehicle first. Now because this vehicle has a double wishbone front suspension, it means that the lower ball joint is loaded. So I've got a jack underneath the lower control arm to remove that load, and I'm going to use my stick to lift up the tire so you can see the axial play. And you'll notice a similar situation over here on the right side of the vehicle. Now I'm going to remove the wheel. So with the wheel removed, we can have a closer look at this double wishbone suspension here. You can see we have the upper control arm. I've already got a video on how to replace that. This is actually an adjustable unit because this vehicle here is actually lowered on this coilover suspension over here. At the bottom here we have the suspension fork, which leads to the lower control arm, and here we have the lower ball joint, which is worn out. Now this is a unitized ball joint, which means that you have to actually replace the entire control arm with the ball joint itself. Over here we've got the stabilizer link, and here at the back of the control arm we have this large ride bushing. It's held on by 2 bolts at the top here and 2 additional bolts on the bottom of this brace over here. We've also got the inner and outer tire rods over here. I'm going to start by spraying down some of the bolts with some penetrating fluid. I'm going to start by loosening up this 17mm strut bolt here. And I'm just going to tap that bolt out there. Next up, I'm going to work on the stabilizer links. So we're just going to put a 17mm socket on that. And there's the nut. Then I'll just reach in from the other side here and tap out that stabilizer link. Next up, we need to remove this nut over here, but there's this cotter pin that's blocking it, so I'm just going to remove that first. And once the cotter pin is removed, I'm going to then remove this 22mm nut. So I got a jack putting some pressure on this knuckle. I'm going to see if I can whip off this nut. Lower that down slowly. Now there's 2 14mm bolts that hold this little bracket on, which is actually a steering stop. We need to remove this in order to get the suspension fork to push down. So I'm just going to insert this bar here to pick this up here. And you can see we've got the lower ball joint and control arm removed from this cone over here. Next up, I'm going to work on removing this front bushing from the subframe. It's got a 19mm bolt that goes all the way through here, so I'm going to try to get at it from down below. Next, I'm going to work on removing these 2 19mm bolts that hold this big bushing at the back here to the frame. So we're just going to remove these 14mm bolts here, and this one's blocked by this brace here. So even by double wrenching this bolt is on there way too tight for me to get off by hand. See if I can melt up this plastic here. That should give me enough clearance there. So I just opted to burn this plastic here. It's my brother's car, so I don't care anyways. That gives me enough socket clearance to get this bolt out, because if I were to remove this plastic, these 10 mils are going to snap all the way through.
Yo, you smell that? Something stinks.
Oh, it's just nothing, don't worry. Next up, I'm going to remove this 14mm bolt that holds the suspension fork on. It's kind of in the way, so we're just going to remove it. And then I'll just slowly remove the suspension fork. Now also underneath this cross brace, I'm going to remove this 14mm bolt to give me a little bit more play to remove that bushing. Let's see if I can pry this down. So with this bolt removed here, I realized that you actually can't remove this rear control arm bushing here without removing the entire brace, and the reason for that is because we have these lines here that go in front of it, and you can't actually pull this control arm bushing out this way because it's going to crash into the lines. You have to drop it down, which means that this frame has to come up. So to do that, there's actually 2 more bolts over here near the jack, one here on either side, as well as this little 10mm bolt over here to remove this entire brace, and the same thing on the other side. Alright, now we'll remove this frame. So now with the cross brace out of the way, I can reach in and wiggle this control arm free from the body of the car. And now I can remove it from the vehicle, just like that. So we've got the OEM control arm removed from the vehicle. This here is the handling bushing because it mostly takes the cornering forces from this ball joint over here. Of course, have the strut bushing over here that supports the weight of the vehicle. Over here we have the ride bushing because it's nice, big, soft, and compliant. And you can see it's got a lot of bolts here that attach to it, so it plays an integral part to connecting the frame with the vehicle. Then of course here we have the ball joint. It's got this cone here that was pressed into the aluminum knuckle, and it's fairly loose. It's pretty much just held on by its boot. So the replacement parts that I'm using are from Mevotech. These are their Supreme line, which are a little bit better than OEM, and it should bolt up nicely. Here we've got the control arms, the tire rods, and the stabilizer links for this vehicle. So we're going to open up this box so that we can see what's inside. So we've got the Mevotech part compared to the OEM part, and you can see that everything looks the same pretty much. We've got the big bushing included here with all the bolting points. We've also got this ball joint over here. It's got a little protector on it and a nice blue boot here. compared to this older boot, but the only thing I see different is we're going to have to transfer this cone over to the new ball joint. It also comes with this steering stop over here that's already bolted on, so I don't have to reuse the OEM one. What's great is Melvotech also includes new hardware, so I don't have to reuse the rusty one from here. So here I've got a ball joint popper on the cone here. So I got the cone popped off here. I'm just going to come with my brother's old t-shirt here. Make sure it's nice and clean and that the ball joint surface is nice and clean, and place that on. Now I'm also going to be replacing the stabilizer links because they're pretty loose and floppy. So we've got the new replacement part from Melvotech. You can see inside of here we have 2 grease fittings, which is good because this is now a serviceable part. You can grease it. It's got these nylock nuts on them. We've got the wrench flats just like the OEM ones, so we can hold on to those. And the ball stud movement on this one is nice and firm, whereas the worn out one is really floppy. I'm just going to go ahead and thread in these grease fittings all the way and just snug those down. Now if you remember how the old one came off, the longer stud went through the control arm and the shorter stud went into the sway bars. So now I'm going to install the new control arm. We've got to get this big bushing in first. Get that around, and then in like that. And at the back here, I'm just going to give this a little bit of encouragement until these 2 holes here line up. I'm just going to use my brother's old toothbrush here to clean up the threads on these frame bolts. Now we live in Canada, so I put anti-seize on everything. So I'll just reinstall the rear frame bolt over here. So I'm just going to put a little bit of anti-seize on this bolt here and give it a little bit of encouragement. Now back at the rear, I'm going to install the other subframe bolt. Now it's really important to make sure that the mating surfaces of the cone is very clean. So I'm just going to spray that down with a little bit of brake cleaner and then come with my brother's old shirt and clean that out. So I'm just going to install this cone into the steering knuckle over here, and then I'm going to reinstall this ball joint. Now I'm trying to align this ball joint over here, but because this axle actually popped out, I need to actually rotate the axle and pop it back in so that the ball joint has enough space to go in. Alright guys, so make sure you're not like me and pull the CV axle completely out when working on this ball joint. This boot popped off and now I can push it back on, but I'm going to have to find a way to clamp it because it's really tight in here. Luckily Melvotech supplies a CV boot kit, which comes with the boot. It also comes with grease in case you mess up, but more importantly, it comes with that clamp. That clamp was pretty hard to get to. It's really tight in here and I had to take off this under panel. And of course I broke a bunch of these 10mm bolts while taking off this splash guard. But it's my brother's car, so we just won't tell him anything. Now things are getting a little bit tight with the ball joint down there, so I'm actually going to remove this bump stop here. I just use a little pry bar here, enough for the ball joint to seat so I can get the threads on to this ball joint now. Next we're going to replace the suspension fork. Now it's really important to keep the inside of this clean because you don't want it to be rusting against the strut. I'm just going to put a whole bunch of anti-seize in this fork here so it doesn't seize up on me next time. Then I'm going to reinstall the suspension fork. Super important to keep the strut fork bolt nice and clean. Let's use a little bit of brake cleaner and my brother's old t-shirt here to clean that up because this tends to rust to the sleeve of the bushing. And then we're going to coat this in some nice anti-seize. Then I'm going to reinstall this 14mm nut. Next I'm going to install the stabilizer linkage into this lower control arm over here, and then I'll reinstall this nylock nut onto the other side over here. Now with everything more or less in place, I'm going to reinstall the steering stop. My brother's the one making all that racket. He's trying to scrape down the frame so we can save it from rusting. Now I'm going to just torque down these 2 big bushing bolts here. Now I'm just going to tighten down the ball joint nut. Now I'm going to reinstall this fork strut bolt over here. The front control arm bushing and the strut bushing need to be torqued when the vehicle is at ride height. So I'm going to jack up the suspension over here until the weight of the vehicle is resting on it completely. The rear control arm bushing comes preset from the factory. Now the torque spec on the strut bolt is 74 foot-pounds. And the torque spec on the front control arm bushing is 87 foot-pounds. We're going to tighten these 2 up to 94 foot-pounds. The ball joint nut gets tightened to 100 foot-pounds. The torque spec on the upper fork bolt is 46 foot-pounds. Torque spec on the stabilizer link 62 foot-pounds on both ball studs. Don't forget to install the cotter pin into the hole over here. So here we have the cross brace assembly. It's nice and painted, and we're going to bolt that up underneath the vehicle. So now we're going to lift up this cross brace here and line it up to the body of the vehicle. So I actually found that these threads here on the control arm are a little bit tight for this bolt, so I'm actually just going to run down the bolt a little bit. Alright, take 2 on putting this cross brace back on. So next I'm going to be working on replacing the outer and inner tie rod and the bellow boot. We have a nut over here which has a cotter pin through it that I need to remove. And I need to remove this jam nut over here to screw off the outer tie rod and then get the inner tie rod off of the rack. I'm going to use a little bit of brake cleaner to clean this interface here and use my brother's old underwear to wipe this down. Just going to put down a piece of tape here and a little bit of spray paint. Remove this tape and you'll see when all of these are nice and aligned, then I know I got my alignment right. I'm going to use a little bit of PE blaster and blast that down. Got my adjustable on there. I'm just going to give it a whack with the hammer. That wasn't too difficult at all. Now the jam nut is free from the outer tie rod. Next I'm going to work on this outer bolt over here. Now I need to remove this cotter pin. Oh, it snapped off. And with the jam nut in its place still, I'm going to unscrew the outer tie rod. With the outer tie rod removed, I'm next going to remove this clamp. Now the steering wheel turned all the way to the right. You can see that there's this little wire here that actually holds on the boot. And the best way to do that is just to come in with my brother's old toothbrush here, put it in between the little tabs, and twist it free until it comes apart. And then pop the boot off of the steering rack here. Now things are about to get a little greasy, so I'm just going to come with my brother's old underwear again and wipe down this rack. Alright, so I got my adjustable wrench on there, and I'm just going to hit it here with a hammer. And there's the inner tie rod removed. There's actually this little rack spacer. So here we have the old tie rod assembly removed from the vehicle compared to the new parts from Meveltech. Here I've got the outer tie rod, the inner tie rod, as well as the bellow kit. Now the advantages of not moving this jam nut is I've kept the alignment, which means that as I tighten this completely, I can actually measure the distance from this inner tie rod surface here to the middle of this tie rod here to approximate my alignment when I assemble this tie rod assembly, so that I can actually drive this car to the alignment shop. Now the tie rod boot kit comes with a zip tie to go around the outside here, which should be much easier to use than these little wires. So with the inner and outer tightened up at the stock settings, I'm just going to take a quick measurement from the back of the inner tie rod to the center of the outer tie rod. Now Meveltech includes a little bit of thread lock around there, so I'm going to thread the inner tie rod into the steering rack. And with the wrench on there, I'm just going to snug this down. Just give that a little tap with the hammer to get it extra tight. I'm just going to put a tiny bit of anti-seize where the boot is going to rest. And I'll just slide this boot on here, and the anti-seize is actually going to help the boot to stay steady while you do your alignment. And alright, next up I'm going to coat these threads in anti-seize, and now I'm going to install the jam nut. Now don't forget to put on a boot clamp if you're reusing the OE one. Now I'm going to thread on the outer tie rod onto the inner tie rod. Now I'm going to use a tape measure and measure from the back of the inner tie rod to the center of the outer tie rod, and that's exactly 12 3/4 inch. And now I'm going to wind down the jam nut on this side, and I need to make sure that the cone surfaces are clean inside of here, and come with my brother's old toothbrush here and clean it out. Now I'm going to insert the outer tie rod into the knuckle. A little touch of anti-seize on this guy. Now if you're using hand tools, I don't know how you're going to tighten this because there's no anti-rotation feature in here. I'm going to see if I can just gun it on. Next I'm going to take a final measurement of the alignment here. However, if I needed to make any adjustments, I would just use a 13mm wrench and either turn the inner tie rod in or out to get this overall dimension to change. Now I'm going to push the boot back over into its seat, and I'll just snug down this jam nut. So now I'm going to put the zip tie over the inner tie rod boot, and now I'm going to turn the steering wheel all the way to the right, and then I'm going to replace the zip tie. Make sure you cut the zip tie so it doesn't hurt anybody else who's under here. So with everything torqued down in the suspension, we're next going to replace the wheel. And now that we've taken care of all the front end components, it's time to move to the rear. Let's remove that rear wheel. And you can see just how worn out this tire is. My brother's pretty stupid for driving this only a couple thousand kilometers without doing a proper alignment. The camber angle is off. It completely eats out the inside of these expensive 20-inch tires. Now taking a look at the suspension on the rear wheel, we've got rear lower control arm over here with the spring. We've got a shock absorber over here. We've got the upper control arm. Then over here we have the trailing arm. Then inside of here we have this link, which is the lower control arm in the front that controls the camber. Of course, we got the little stabilizer link over here. Now the lower control arm is the one we're going to be replacing. It's held on by one point over here at the knuckle, and then another point over here. There we have a little diagram of the multi-link suspension in the rear of the vehicle at stock ride height. We got the little spring and the damper over here attached to the lower control arm. Now what happens when we lower the vehicle, the spring here becomes shorter, and this lower arm actually angles upward, which causes an increase in the camber angle on this wheel here, which will cause excessive tire wear. Now in order to negate this, we need to adjust this lower control arm here by either adjusting its length or using cam ball to bring this wheel back into proper alignment. I'm going to start by spraying down these two bolts and nuts here with some PV blaster. Now I'm just going to remove the 17mm bolt from the knuckle side. Now I'm going to remove the 17mm bolt on the inside. Now this little cam washer here actually holds the alignment. I'm just going to use a little punch here and punch out this bolt. Now I'm going to give this guy a little hit with the hammer here. So this bolt here is actually being really difficult to remove. I cannot push it through the bushing. It's likely seized to the bushing. So we're going to have to cut it off. So I was able to rotate the arm and break the bolt free from the sleeve here. If you tilt it, you can kind of push the bolt out this way and remove it like that. And so here we have the old part compared to the new part from Meveltech. You can see this here has the turnbuckle that can be adjusted to adjust the length, which will adjust the toe and the camber on the suspension. Now this kit also comes with this camber bolt, and this is actually not to replace the bolt I cut off, but it's actually to replace the bolt on the lower rear control arm, because both of these have to be adjusted together in order to control toe and camber. Luckily the hardware that comes with the kit is the same size as the hardware that we cut off, and Meveltech does sell that separately, So we can just replace that with a brand new bolt and lube it up to make sure it does not seize anymore when we do the alignment. Since we live in Canada, we don't use Loctite because that naturally grows as rust on all the vehicles. In fact, I use anti-seize on everything because I don't want this to seize up next time I have to do an alignment. So with the anti-seize on there, I'm going to go ahead and align this turnbuckle. And once that's exactly aligned, I'm going to wind up these jam nuts all the way to the edges here. And that will lock this alignment together so that we can at least drive this car to the alignment shop. And I'll just snug this nut down on this side. So this here is the rear lower control arm that supports the spring. Where it bolts to the body here, we have a bolt and a nut, which we're going to replace with the cam bolt provided in the kit. That's going to give this arm a little bit more adjustability in this direction than the stock bolt, so we can get the alignment specs properly. Now I'm going to remove the spring pressure from this lower control arm. I've already removed the bolt, so we're just going to slowly drop the jack down, and that should allow me to remove this spring over here. Spray this down with some penetrating fluid. Then I'm going to remove the 17mm nut. Now this might be a little difficult, but I'm going to try to beat off this nut. Hopefully it's not stuck in the bushing. And this bolt is really stuck into that bushing there. It does not want to come out. I've tried an air hammer, multiple soaks with PD Blaster, beating it with a hammer, and I still can't get it out. I really didn't want to cut this off, but I'm going to have to because this arm is really hard to find aftermarket. So after cutting for a while, this bolt decided to finally break free from its rust, and I can feel it just turn properly. So after a lot of work, I finally got this control arm out by getting the bolt unstuck. You can see all of the corrosion in here where it got stuck to the inner sleeve. This is pretty much the most difficult part of the job. And this, folks, is the reason why we put anti-seize on every bolt and we don't use thread lock in Canada, because it literally grows on trees. So I was able to take the old control arms over to a vise to push the old bushings out just using the ball joint press. Luckily I was able to find these white line bushings that are actually a perfect fit, and I just used the press to push it back in. Now the new cam bolts for the rear controller come with this paper template that you have to install here to drill out the width of these holes to allow for more camber adjustment. So I'm just going to install that in between the two tabs over there, and then coming with a little bit of paint to mark that. And you can see with the template removed how much we need to drill out on this side and on the back side. Now this is the kind of drill tip you want to use to enlarge those holes. So now if I inserted the new bolt, you can see that it can freely move back and forth. Now while there's no lower control arm blocking the way, I'm going to take the opportunity to remove the stabilizer link and change it out for a fresh one. So here we have the new stabilizer link from Mevlutech. It's the same exact fitment as the old one. It also comes with new hardware as well as grease fittings so we can service them. So I'm just going to install this grease fitting onto the back plate here. I don't want these to get rusted, so I'm just going to put a little anti-seize on the studs. Now this one also comes with a washer that I'm going to place over top the ball stud, and then I'm going to install it into this bracket on the upper control arm. And then I'm going to install this hardware that comes with it, flip that 17mm wrench onto the ball stud, and tighten down the nut from the other side. I don't want to deal with stuck bushings again. I'm just going to load this bolt up with some real good anti-seize. Now we'll install that front control arm. And I'm going to slip on this D-shaped washer over here and then install this provided lock nut. Over on the knuckle side, I'm just going to align the arm with the knuckle and then insert the bolt. And then I'm going to install this nut over here. Then let's loosely snug this down. So I was finally able to source a bushing that fits in this control arm. It's from White Line. It's actually a polyurethane bushing, which means I need to apply some of the lubricant to the surface over here. And it just slides right in like that. Now the bushing is a little bit small, so I might just have to shim it. So with the washer installed on the bolt head, I'm just going to apply a lot of anti-seize because I don't want this seizing again on me. And I'll bring in the lower control arm here and slide this bolt through. And then now I can install this washer on this side and install the lock nut. Now I'm just going to snug this down lightly. Now with the control arm supported, I'm going to insert the spring. Slowly I'm going to jack up the lower control arm here. And once everything's all lined up, I'm just going to push this bolt into the bushing on the knuckle here. Now with the jack completely lifting up this side of the suspension, we are going to tighten all of the bushing bolts at ride height. That's to ensure that the bushings are actually not stressed when the vehicle's weight is resting on it for this corner. I'm also going to tighten up the front control arm as well. Now all of the lower control arm nuts tighten up to 54 foot-pounds with the exception of the front lower arm where it attaches to the knuckle. It goes up to 65 foot-pounds. The stabilizer link at the upper control arm is 52 foot-pounds and at the sway bar is only 41 foot-pounds. Now in order to perform an alignment on one of these, all you need to do is turn the bolt, not the nut, and you can see just how the control arm actually moves in and out relative to the subframe to give you a couple of degrees of camber. Now when the alignment is in spec, we're just going to hold down the bolt and tighten up this nut to torque spec. Now in order to adjust the toe and camber alignment on the front link, you just have to loosen up the jam nuts and then turn the turnbuckle according to the alignment specs. And with all the bolts to torque spec, we are done on this side. I can then lower the rear control arm to drop it back down. Finally, we're going to reinstall the rear wheel and torque it to spec. Finally, we're going to take the vehicle for a test drive to make sure all the suspension noises and clunks are gone, and then we'll take the vehicle over to the alignment rack for a proper alignment. And that's pretty much how to refresh the entire suspension system on your car. Make sure you follow me on Instagram for more behind the scenes footage, and subscribe for more videos just like this one. Well, unfortunately, the car did not make it back from the test drive without bursting a hole in the tire on the highway, just due to excessive camber wear. Better luck next time, buddy. And now he's even got a flat on that donut.